All right, welcome back to another live stream. Thank you guys for joining in. I hope you can hear me. I've got a new setup going on. Hopefully the quality is good and you can see me. You can hear me okay. If you've got any issues, let me know in the chat. So, what we're going to be doing today... Oh, hey Dane. What we're going to be doing today is looking at starting projects. So my chat's over there. Yeah, hopefully you guys can hear me. This is the first time that I'm trying out this setup, so and also hopefully my camera doesn't die halfway through. So how to start Python projects, and this is not something that I've done that much of for a long time, but recently I've started to sort of learn a bit more about how to do it, and I've also started noticing what things are most important for a Python project when we're getting started. So we're going to talk about Python versions, Python version setup. We're also going to talk about virtual environments. We're going to talk about tooling. We're going to talk about logging. And then we'll also talk a little bit about documentation, both for your own project and also we're going to look at documentation for other projects and how you can read documentation a bit more easily. Maybe we'll delve into sort of note taking for code, but we'll see how we do. I can hear you. That's good. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, let's go here and hopefully you guys can see this. So I've got a new project here. We're going to sort of get started, and the way to get started is always with your Python version. So what Python version do you want to support is an important question. If you are making an application that you're going to deploy yourself in your own server and you can control basically everything about the environment in which your application is going to run, then I would use the latest Python version. If you are going to share your application or it's a library that you're making that other people are going to install, then you're probably going to have to support a few different Python versions, and that complicates things a little bit. By the way, I'm a bit ill, got a bit of a cold, so if you can hear that when I'm talking, then sorry about that. Hopefully it's not too distracting. I do have my hydration. So, let me bring something in here. This is basically your best friend in terms of installing Python versions, and that's pyenv. I use pyenv to manage my Python versions. Basically how it works is you install it for Mac or Linux, and then you can use it to install Python versions, and also you can use it to select what Python version you're going to use for a certain project. Very simple. It sounds complicated, it really isn't. And if you're using Windows, then you want to use pyenv-win for running on Windows. Once you've got it installed, then let me zoom in here. Once you've got it installed, then in any folder where you're creating your project, you can type pyenv local 311.3, for example, and that creates this .python version file. And that doesn't do anything except now you can do pyenv exec python, and that runs that Python version. If you want to install a Python version, you can go to pyenv install -- list, and then that shows you all the Python versions that you could install So I'm gonna just go over to the main release versions. You can see you've got all of them here. 3.12 is already in development mode. You can install that as well, which is nice. Then when you want to install one, you just do pyenv install 3.11.3, and then you can do pyenv local 3.11.3, and then pyenv exec. And then whatever you run now will use the Python version that you've got selected. So this brings us to the next step, which is packaging and virtual environments. So once you've selected your Python version and you have access to it like this, you can do pyenv exec python-m to run a Python module. And the Python module we're going to run is venv, which is a Python module for creating virtual environments. And then we're going to type .venv to create a virtual environment called .venv. So as you can see, that creates your virtual environment. And this is linked to the Python version that you installed with pyenv that you selected as the local version. So that is the virtual environment there, and it doesn't have any libraries installed, but you can install any libraries you want and they will be kept within this virtual environment. We've got a video and a blog post on virtual environments which explains everything quite thoroughly. So if you're not sure how virtual environments work, then I recommend checking that out. Now that you've got your virtual environment, the next step is to write down your dependencies. So let's create a requirements.txt file. And here we're going to write any requirements files that our application needs to run. So for example, let's say we're making a Flask app and we need Flask, and maybe we need python.env. Just keep it simple. But when we are developing our project, we may need a few more libraries in order to work on the project locally. So that's where requirements-dev.txt comes into play. And the name here is totally up to you. Some people do requirements.dev.txt. It doesn't matter as long as it's pretty obvious that the requirements that are listed in this file are needed to run the code for development. The ones that are listed in this other file are needed to run the code in production. So what goes in your requirements-dev.txt? Well, PyTest, for example, to run your tests. Maybe you'll put rough for your linter. Ruffian, I don't even know if that's a thing. Copilot being too helpful there. You could add black for formatting. You could add white. Also don't know if that's a thing. isort for sorting your imports. If you're wondering what rough, black, and isort do, we also have a blog post on that. But yeah, so rough is a linter, and that checks your code and tells you what's going on. If there's any potential problems or actual problems, like you've imported something but you haven't used it, or maybe one of your lines is too long, etc. Rough is going to kind of tell you about these issues. And you can ask it to fix the issues automatically, and then it tries to do so. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't, but it's pretty good. Black is a code formatter, so when you write your code, it's going to change it so that the functionality remains the same, but the look of the code changes. And that's just so if you have multiple different people in a team and they are all typing code in a slightly different way, Black will reformat everybody's code so it all looks the same. It makes it a bit easier to read. isort does the same thing, but for imports, so it's going to reformat your imports so that system imports are at the top, third-party libraries are underneath, and your own code imports are at the bottom, and within each group it's going to sort them alphabetically, and there's a few other things that it's going to do as well. Okay, so this is a pretty standard starting point for any Python project. Then the other thing you will want to do whenever you are starting a Python project is make sure your editor is set up correctly. So if we go over to the extensions, you'll see that there is a black formatter extension in Visual Studio Code, which we are going to install. There's also an isort extension that you also want to install. I don't think there's a rough extension yet. Oh, there is. So yeah, install that as well. So we're going to need those 3 extensions. Then the next thing you want to do is go over to your settings, which you can do with Command comma or Control comma on Windows. Then go to your workspace settings, then go to this little icon at the top right to open the settings in JSON format, and that is going to create this .bs code folder and settings.json inside it. Now, inside this file, we're going to add a few things that I'm actually going to take from the new course that I'm working on. Let me just show you what we're going to add in here. We are going to grab this. So I'll share that in the Discord server. So that's on the live channel in the Discord server if you want to have a look at it. Basically what this does is whenever you save a file, it's going to reformat it. It's going to run any formatting tools. So that's black and isort. Then we're going to tell Rough to not organize imports because we're going to use isort for that. I still need to look into this. I think Rough, well, obviously Rough can organize your imports, but I'm not sure if it can do it in the same way as isort can. So this is something for me to look at. Then this key here is going to say that for Python files specifically, we're going to run the following actions whenever we save a file. And these two here are two actions that we can potentially do. One of them is organize imports, which we're not using Rough, so we're going to use isort. And the other one is fix all, which is using Rough. It's going to try to go through all your linter issues and it's going to try to fix them. If it can fix them, then it will. If it's not sure how to fix them because it's something that maybe is a little bit ambiguous, then it won't. So it's pretty safe. And by the way, if you guys have any questions at any point, let me know in the chat. Okay, so now we are pretty much ready to start coding, which is good. And the first thing to do is to make a folder for your source code, because as you can see, we're already having quite a few different files and folders at the top level of our project. There's a lot of configuration things going on, and we don't want our source code Python files to all be spread out between these other files. So let's make another folder, which I'm going to call sample proj, or you can call it whatever you want. This would normally be like a relevant name for your project. For example, if you're working on a stores and items API, you may call it store API. If you were working on some sort of merch store using Django, you could call it merch store or merch. You can call it whatever you want, but make sure it's a relevant name for your project. And the reason why will be apparent in a second. So all your source code is going to come in here. So you're likely going to have a dunder init.py in here. And we're going to tell it to use black there as the entry point to your project. Then you will have other files and folders such as models. Let's make a model user.py, etc. Or obviously, depending on what kind of application you're building, it'll be this way or a different way. But the key thing is all your source code is now in this folder. Everything that's outside it is configuration files for the project. Now, something else that you'll probably want to do in here is to have some sort of testing framework set up. So what does that look like? Well, let me show you. You're probably going to have a folder in here called tests. And then in this folder, I normally like to replicate the structure of the project. So you could have models in here. Then let's say that you've got some functions that you've written in your init.py file, then you would probably add a new file within the tests folder, but not within models, called tests or test init.py, for example. And then That's not inside the models folder. Then inside models, you could write test user.py and you would write your tests that are relevant here. It's unlikely that you will have tests for your models, but it could happen. I'm just showing you the sort of structure that I would follow. Then the next thing that you probably want is to set up your logging configuration. So that's inside your project folder, but in a file called logging_conf.py. And there's a few different logging libraries for Python, such as Loguru, which seems pretty popular, but I like sticking with the default built-in logging library. I think it's plenty powerful, does everything you need. You just need to set it up, but I'm going to show you how to set it up just now. So to configure your logging using the built-in logging library, you're going to write a dictionary with the logging configuration inside it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a function called configure logging, and then this is going to do logging.dict config, and it's going to pass in a dictionary in there. We'll need to import logging, and now we are going to set up our logging information here. Covered a lot of logging in the new Fast API course, so I'm going to kind of take some stuff from there. But the first thing is version is 1. This is just a key that tells the Python logging module that you want to use version 1 of the logging config file syntax. And at the moment, there's only one version, so this really doesn't do anything. But in the future, if more versions come out, this will tell it to use version 1. Then, this is what we need. Disable existing loggers false is going to make sure that any loggers that you define within your config dictionary will be used, but any other loggers that are enabled in your application from beforehand are not going to be disabled. Sometimes you want to turn this to true, and I'll show you when in a minute. Then you have filters, formatters, handlers, and loggers. These are the 4 things that make up the logging module. So there's quite a lot to go on. There's quite a lot of information, but let me explain simply what they do. When you use a logger, you emit what's called a log record. So for example, here in init, we can do import logging. We can do logger equal logging.get logger. And then we can do logger.info hello world, for example. There are other ways to emit logging information. Trace, maybe trace doesn't exist by default. Anyway, info debug error critical warning. There you go. Like that. So, that. Like this or like this? I wonder which one comes first. There you have it. Debug info warning. Debug info warning. There. Okay, sorry about that. So these are the 5 default ways that you've got to emit a log record. So you can say .debug, and this emits a log record with this message and a level of debug. And so is the same for every other one of these. They don't have any other difference other than the level at which they are emitted or stored, or the use case for it is depending on the level that you set. Some of these will be shown and others won't be shown. For example, while you're working and coding locally, you may want to show them all, but when you deploy your application to production, maybe you only want to show warning, error, and critical, so that you don't have a lot of debug information in your production logs that you don't need for anything because you're not going to be looking at them. So With that said, let's go back to our login config. That is something that can be set or limited at the logger level. So let's create a logger called sample proj. And this logger, we can now say, has a level of debug, for example. Let's delete that for now. And now what would happen is whenever we use the sample proj logger, any message that is debug level or above would be shown, and anything under it would not be shown. There's nothing under it, so everything would be shown, but you can set it to warning, for example, and now only warning and above would be shown. Cool. Okay, so the next thing up is the handler. A handler simply says, where should the logs go? For example, you can get the logs to go to the console, or you can put them into a file, you can put them into some sort of cloud logging storage service, etc. So let's define a handler, such as one called console, that puts logs to the console. So what we do is, indeed, that class is logging.streamHandler, and by default, when you use logging.streamHandler as the class, they go out to the console. Okay. Something else you can do at the handler level is define the level of logs that are going to be filtered by the handler. So loggers can have a level filtering mechanism, and handlers can have that too. Normally, I leave it as debug at the handler level, and then I adjust it at the logger level, but that's up to you. Now, the next thing that the handler needs is a formatter. And the formatter is something that we're going to define in a second. And yeah, so that's that. Now, let's go into the formatter. The name of the formatter has to match, and then each formatter simply defines what the log message looks like when it's displayed. So you can see here we are logging hello world, but normally when we log something, we want to display a bit more information about the status of the environment. For example, the current time is something that you may want to display, or the file where the logs were emitted from, and that is something that you can do with a format. So let me show you a formatter that I've got here. It's pretty straightforward. We'll start with class is logging formatter. There you go. Let me fix that. Okay. So the logging.formatter class is just used to format logs according to a string, which is the format string. So I don't like that default one, but we're gonna do this. Yeah. So in the format string, you use %-based interpolation, and you've got access to a whole bunch of variables, such as ASC time for the current time at which the log was emitted, the level name, which is debug or info or warning. Then you've got the name of the logger, for example, sample proj or others. I'll show you what this looks like in a second. And then this is just a colon, like an actual literal colon to be put into the text. Then you've got line number, so that's the line number of the file that the log was emitted from. It can be pretty helpful, so you can find your way around log messages and where they were. And you can see that all of them have an S at the end because all of these variables are strings except line no, because that's a number, so you've got the D at the end. Then you've got a space and a dash. These are literal spaces and dashes, don't mean anything. And finally, you've got the message itself, which is what we emitted. So you can see that the log is going to have a bit more information than what we actually logged, and that's good. We don't want to have to put the current time into all our logs. The last thing you can do is format the date. So you can say date fmt, and then you can use this, which is the default. Well, the default actually has a T there, which I quite like. So %y just means the year as a 4-digit number, %m is the month as a 2-digit number, %d is a day as a 2-digit number, t is just the letter T, a literal, then hour, minute, and seconds as 2-digit numbers as well. You can access strftime.org for a full reference as to what all of these things mean. It uses the same syntax as the datetime module does. Okay, so this is why people don't like, I'm going to delete the filters, by the way, because we're not going to use them. This is why people don't like the logging module. This is why libraries like Loguru have gotten popular, because there's quite a bit going on. But to be honest, I just copy paste this. So there's actually not much to learn other than loggers have handlers, handlers have formatters, and then you just do logger dot whatever and you send your log messages. Which, by the way, reminds me that we didn't use this handler anywhere. We do have to do that. So we'll say handlers is a list of handlers of which we've got the console. Now, if you wanted to also put things into a file, you can do that, of course. You just use logging.file handler, and then it's basically the same thing. Okay. But even better would be, instead of logging.file handler, we're going to use logging.handlers.rotating file handler. And then we also give it a file name, and we also give it a max bytes, which is going to be 1 megabyte. There you go. Backup count and the encoding. There you go. So what does this do? Well, a rotating file handler creates a file called sampleproj.log. And after the file reaches 1 megabyte in size from all your logs being printed out and saved to the file, it will create sampleproj.log.to. And then it will keep the next logs in there. And when that file reaches 1 megabyte, if the backup count wasn't 2, then it would then create .log.3 and so forth. But if the backup count is 2, then it would start overwriting the first one. So you only keep 2 megabytes in total of logs in here. This can be pretty helpful for when you have a lot of logs and you want to make sure you can go back to them later, because the console has a pretty limited context size. So sometimes you can't scroll back up all the way. So having these things here can be helpful at times. Then make sure to not forget any commas like I've done, and you've got your file handler in there as well. Okay, so any questions for now? Oh, I see there are a few questions actually. Sorry about that. I totally missed it. So a couple of questions. Sriyesh, don't worry, my man. You accidentally became a full stack developer. That's good. That's a good problem to have. We are going over starting a project and sort of the main parts of it and how I like to start them. So we've got things like project structure, IDE setup, Python version, virtual environments. Now we're going over logging. And also we briefly covered tests. Carlos, quick question and a bit on the topic. Making a video on how to approach the first job hunt. Sure. Thank you for the suggestion. I'll have a think about that, but yeah, it's not something that I have all that much experience with, to be honest. Whenever I found a job, it's been pretty straightforward. You know, you find companies, you apply, and then the luck of the draw. I saw VM. Is it still good to use VM with Docker available? Yeah, I would use Docker with a VM. Creating the VM doesn't take very long at all. So I would always use VM. Yeah. Yeah, you can run the whole project in Docker if you want, but I would still use VM. It doesn't cost much in terms of processing power. And also it means that if by any reason, for any reason, you end up modifying something in the system install or installing a library that's a newer version of something else that was already installed in your Docker container or something like that, it's just you don't have to worry about it, and it's free, yeah, basically. So I would use VM. All right. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is this logger name, because this is actually where the confusion happens. We've created our logger called sample proj, but then here we have got a logger called dunder name. So let me activate my virtual environment. So I'll do source VM bin activate. Then I'll do pip install -r requirements.txt, and we'll do pip install -r requirements-dev.txt. We don't need any of this for the logging module. The logging module is all built in. But then we're going to do Python sample proj init.py. So this is not something that you're normally going to do, right? Because normally the init.py is something that runs for you. You don't run it like this, typing Python and then dunder init.py, right? But you can see we've got hello world, hello world, hello world. Okay, now let's import our logging conf and configure the logging so that those things that we've written here take effect. So we'll do from sample proj logging conf import configure logging, and then we're going to configure logging. So now when we run this again, pop quiz, is it going to work or is it not going to work? This is your chance to validate your knowledge of Python imports and file folder structure. I'll answer some questions while you guys think about it. Will this work or will this not work? When we have set up the project, do we continue with requirements.txt? Yes. Yes, always use requirements.txt for your requirements. And requirements-dev.txt for your development requirements. There are other options instead of requirements.txt that you can use, but I like using requirements.txt. Do you turn off logging when deploying the project? We talked about that earlier. You don't turn off logging, but normally you will change the level at which you log. So while developing, you probably use debug level logging. When deploying, you probably use warning level logging. So nobody's said whether this will work or not. You don't think the logging is going to work. Okay. Nothing's going to work, in fact. You get an error. You get an error because you try to run sample proj /dunder-init.py. And what that tells Python is the starting point for the code, for the interpreter, is this file. So what the Python interpreter sees is the stuff inside this file. So when you do from sampleproj.loggingconf import that, it doesn't know what sampleproj is because it's already inside that folder. So this is something that so many of my students have issues with. So yeah, we've told it to go inside the folder and then it can't find anything that's outside of it. So what you want to do is python-m sampleproj. And then now that actually works. It actually can see what's inside the sample project. But I actually made a mistake here. We have to do import logging.config. I think that's it. Logging.config.config. I think that's how it's supposed to be. So that's my bad. Okay. Now we got it working. So ignore this warning there for a second because we'll get to that. But now you can see the logs are being printed out as you would expect. So you've got the time, you've got the level, sample proj, which is the logger name, :11, that's the line number, the hello world. So as you can see, the logger name is sample proj. But why is the logger name sample proj when we have said get logger dunder name there? So what's the value of dunder name? And that's the next thing that you kind of have to understand in order to use the logging module correctly, is what this dunder name variable means. So whenever you run a script, let's say you do Python, let's make a Python file here, hello.py, and we print dunder name, right? Yeah, still there. That was a bit confusing. Python hello.py. We're printing dunder name. You can see that the value that we get out of dunder name is dunder main. So that's kind of weird. Then let's create another file called something.py, and here we're also gonna print dunder name. So if we do Python hello.py, we get dunder main, and if we do Python something.py, we also get dunder main. The reason for that is whenever you run Python and then any file, that is called running the file as a script. So whenever you run a Python file as a script, the entry point file's dunder name variable is always dunder main. But if you go to hello.py or any other file and you say import something, and we'll add that so that this comment here makes it so that rough doesn't delete this import because it's unused. Okay, so this doesn't actually have any meaning except make sure that rough doesn't delete it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to, when we run hello.py, we're going to import something.py, and that's going to print dunder name. Then we're going to come back here and we're going to print dunder name. If you didn't know, when you import something with Python, you run the file. So import something is going to run this file. Now we'll do Python hello.py, and you can see things start to change. Now the first import, which is import something, goes to print dunder name. You see something printed out. Then we come back here and we print hello.py's dunder name, and you see dunder main printed out. So the entry point dunder name is always dunder main. So we ran Python hello.py. Hello.py's dunder name is dunder main. But everything that we import does actually have a dunder name value, which is the import path. So because something is in the same folder as hello.py, then import path of something.py is just something. But if you create another folder like else, for example, and you put something.py inside it, then when you go into hello, you now have to say import from else. That's not gonna work. Let me choose a different name. Rename something else. There you go. We'll say from something else, or say import something else, something. Let's say that. Yeah. Now we're going into a folder, so when we run the file again, you see the import path to something.py is something else.something. So why is this important? This is important because you'll see that when things are inside a folder, and this is where things are going to start to make more sense, when things are inside a folder such as sample proj, their import path always starts with that folder's name. So that for anything that we import in sample proj, their import path is going to be sample proj dot logging conf or sample proj dot models dot user, or sampleproj.tests.models.test_user, etc. Basically, sampleproj is going to be always at the beginning. So that is important because, let me just delete hello.py and something else.py. These are just tests. Why is that important? Because if we go in here and create another file such as router.py, which is a pretty common name, and here we're going to import logging, and we're going to do logger equal logging get logger name, and then we're going to do logger error. So now we've got the logging being used a bit more widely in our application. We've got init.py, which is sampleproj.init.py. And we've also got sampleproj.router. And in both cases, the logger that we're getting starts with sampleproj. Let me show you. Python-m sampleproj. We actually also need to import sampleproj.router. We'll do that so it doesn't get deleted. Let me run that again. I think I messed something up. Oh yeah, I did mess something up. Let me move the configure logging up to the top. This is something that you don't actually need to do when you're making a project, but you do for this example. So the configure logging has to run before we import sampleproj.router because this uses the logger, and if the logger is not configured, then you're not going to see anything printed up. Okay, so I've run that again, and now you can see we've got 4 log lines. Sampleproj.router, and then sampleproj. But if you remember, in our logging conf py, we defined a single logger, which is sampleproj. We didn't define a logger called sampleproj.router. So what's happening? Loggers inherit from one another. So if you have sampleproj.router, this is actually a logger, which is its own logger, but it inherits all its configuration settings from sampleproj. That's the parent router. And if you have multiple routers with a dot in their name, then they inherit from the previous ones. This is interesting because the logger inheritance mechanism works in the same way as the Python imports mechanism. So by simply using the dunder name logger name, you're always giving your logger a name which matches the import path. If you put all your source code inside a single folder, all of your source code files are going to have a logger name that starts with that folder's name. Then, if you configure that folder's name as a logger, all your code files and folders will use that logger. So you only have to configure one logger one time, and all your source code uses that logger. So this was a very roundabout way of explaining why this is interesting, but hopefully it makes sense. Let me just go over it again. You can define a logger by, or you can configure a logger by giving it a name and then defining its configuration properties. And you can say sampleproj has these configuration properties. You can say sampleproj.router has these configuration properties, etc. These are just logger names. But all loggers are divided by the dot and inherit from the logger above it. For example, if you have sampleproj.router.user, this logger inherits from router, which inherits from sampleproj. So you actually don't, if these are the same, this is a wasted line because this router is already inheriting from sampleproj. They are the same, therefore this is not necessary. By having everything inside a single folder and running that as a package, everything inside this folder uses the logger that you've defined, as long as the logger name matches the top level package folder. Hi Andy, welcome. Sriyesh, you asked, how can this setup be automated? I'm not 100% sure what you mean. Can you elaborate on that? But I don't automate really any of this. Anyway, let's cover the next thing while Surish elaborates on that. The final thing is this warning here. No module name sample main, so this can't be executed. Basically, whenever you have a package and you want to run it, like we're doing here, Python m sample proj, the dunder init file runs first, and then there's another file called main.py that runs after, right? So if you want to run something as a package, as we're doing here, then you need to create main.py. But this was always meant to be a Flask app. So let's use it as a Flask app. So we'll say from Flask, import Flask. We actually need to select interpreter, and we need to make sure to use virtual environment. Then we'll do app is Flask name. Actually, let me put this into a function. Then we'll do this hello world. Okay. Can you create a command line script that can set up the whole project? Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. You could create a command line that basically takes this entire thing. You just give it the name of the project, and it would create the folder with the basic setup inside it, the logging conf with the logger name already set up. So yeah, you could do that. Okay, so I've got this here. Now we're going to do from sampleproj.logging conf import configure logging, and this is the key thing. We're going to configure the logging here. So the key difference between our earlier example and any Flask app or Fast API app or whatever else that you want to make is our earlier example was a few Python files that just ran top to bottom. So we had to configure the logging before we did any logging. With a Flask app, the logging is going to happen when you make requests to the app. So as long as you configure the logging when the app is created, it will always be configured by the time that requests are handled. So we can just run configure logging here, and by the time we receive a request, it's gonna be configured. So let me save that. I'm gonna delete router.py because we don't use that for anything. And now we're gonna do Flask run. This is not gonna work. We need to do Flask run sample project. I think. Let me create Flask env .flask env Flask app is sample proj. I think this is how to do it. Sample proj. We need to return the app. There you go. Sorry, I have actually not done this with Flask for a while. I've been working on the Fast API course. So .flask env allows us to define certain configuration parameters for the Flask command line interface, Flask_app. It tells us where to find it. By default, when you give it a folder name, it goes into names, the folder names dunder init. And by default, the Flask's command line interface will run the create app function, and it uses that app. Okay, so we've got that. And we've accessed it here in the browser. You can see hello world comes out, which is good. But you've got these logs in here, which are not sample proj logs. These are logs that Flask and its related libraries emit. So let's emit some of our own logs and then see what happens. So we'll do import logging. Logger is logging get logger name. Saving that, you can see gets reformatted. Now we'll do logger war info printing hello, for example. Now let's restart this app and refresh the page. You can see nothing gets printed out. So that would be expected because our logger is limited to warning level and above. So let's set it to debug, restart the app, refresh the page. Now you can see we get our log printed out down there. App.route is a decorator. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So there you have your logs, and there you have the Flask logs, all of these other ones. If you set disable existing loggers to true, then I would expect the existing logs to be eliminated. But as you can see, they are not. So something else you can do is override the loggers. So I can't remember what logger this used. I think it's workzoig. Let's override this one there. I'm not 100% sure how this disable existing loggers thing works. I need to look into that. So let's disable the workzoig or enable it, but using our own handlers. Let's see what happens. Now you can see that things have changed a little bit. If you're not very familiar with Flask, maybe you can't see that things have changed a little bit. But earlier on, we had the logs that looked like that. So that's the IP address, and then there's the time, and then there's a message and so forth. Now we've got something that is a bit different. You've got the message there, and then here, this one comes from workzoig. You've got a pretty long message in there. So there you have it. Something that you could do with this, if you're not interested in seeing all the workzoig logs, is you could set workzoig to warning, and then you're not gonna basically see any of them. Then they're all gone. So this is interesting because depending on the environment that you're in, you may want to use a certain level for some things and a different level for some other things. So I'll leave that to you to figure out. The other thing that you would probably want to look at is telling your application what environment it's in. So are you currently in development mode or are you in production mode? And then automate the levels and the handlers. For example, in local mode, maybe you don't want a file handler, and maybe you only want it in prod, etc. So to do that, I'm gonna leave you guys with a link. Actually, I had a link, but the link's dead now, so I can't give you the link. Let me find it a different way. Yep, no, the link's definitely dead. How do you test if the file handler works? I mean, this is not your code. Technically, all of this is just a config file, so there's nothing to test there. You don't need to test the logging module that comes with Python, so you don't have to test that, I would say. So I was going to leave you guys with a link, but actually the website that I was going to use is dead, so I guess we'll just cover it now. So let's create a .env file. A .env file is where we put environment variables for our application. These are normally secrets that we want to use in our application. For example, database connection strings, API keys for third-party services, things like that. But we can also put other things. For example, let's put env_state equal dev. And now we're going to use this environment variable to tell our application that we're running in development mode. In production, you could set this to prod, for example. Now let's go to sample prod and we're going to create config.py. And now we're also going to install another library called Pydantic. So let's do pip install -r requirements.txt. We're going to install Pydantic. And Pydantic is a data validation library. So basically how you can use it is you can say from Pydantic import base settings. And then we're going to define a base config class that inherits from base settings. And now Pydantic has a few things that you can use to load a .env file into this class. So we'll say env state is optional str. Well, none. We'll do from typing import optional, from typing import optional. And now we say class config. env file is .env. The encoding is not necessary. Okay, so when you do this, now Pydantic will be able to load the .env file and put it into base config.env state. So down here, we're going to do config equal base config. So now when we create an object of base config, because we've given it this inner config class with env file, it's going to go into the env file, look at env state, populate the env state class variable, and you're going to have access to config.env state. And that should be dev. So back in logging conf, we can do from sample proj config import config, and that's going to import the config variable that we defined at the bottom. And then you can do something like handlers is console, and Copilot already knows how to do this. I don't like that. Handlers console. There you go. But instead of production, we're going to call it prod. Okay, so this is a very crude way of doing it. There's more information to be learned about configuration management. But yeah, now you've got a list which has console in it, which is our console handler. But if the env state is equal to prod, then you get console and file, and then you can use the handlers down here. Like that. You can also do the same thing for the level. Now let's delete the log file and we're gonna run this again. And now you can see that the log file is created there. That shouldn't be done, but it doesn't have anything. That's weird. I would have not expected that to be created, but I guess when you configure the logger, it creates the file for you. Learn something new. So it seems the file is created even if you don't put anything in it, just by virtue of being defined. But you can see there's nothing in it. If you turn that off, go to .env and change this to prod, then you run this again. Now I would expect things to be going into there. Yeah, there you go. Okay, some more questions. Data validation, meaning database? No. It is a library for ensuring that incoming data, well, it's a library for being able to define what incoming data should look like in terms of its type. And then when you give it data, it will make sure it matches that data type by either conversion or giving you an error if the data type doesn't match. So it also has this settings management side of things. And yeah, this is how you use it. So we're not really using it for the data validation aspect, but it is something that we do use Pydantic, that is in my upcoming Fast API course for data validation in the API for data coming in from users and being returned back to users. Is it .env an OS/env file? No, it's just a text file. Nothing to do with your operating system. It's just a text file. .env is the usual name, but you can give it a different name if you want. Okay, so now let's get into something a bit more interesting with this, and we're going to call it a day after that. Let's say that you have a few different environment variables that you want to pass in. For example, database URL is going to be SQLite, something like that. So this is the database URL that you want to use when you're working locally. But when you're working in prod, you want to use a Postgres database, kind of like this. This is a very common problem to have, and this Pydantic settings management library or data validation library with settings management also allows it. We're going to create a global config class which inherits from base config, and here we're going to define database URL, which is an optional string. Okay. So now we've got base config, which tells us or tells Pydantic to go into the .env file and look at the env state variable. Then we've got global config, which also goes into the .env file, but this time it looks at database URL. And then we're going to have a couple other classes, such as dev config. It's going to be like this, and then prod config, and it's going to be prefix, maybe prefix there. Prod config, which is going to be like that. So what does this tell Pydantic to do? Well, if we try to access devconfig.database URL, it's not going to go into the .env file and look at database URL. It's going to go into the .env file and look at dev_database URL. So what this config variable here says is, for any environment variables that you want to load into prod config, make sure that they are prefixed by prod_. For any environment variables that you want to load into dev config, make sure they are prefixed by dev_. So now we go into our .env file and we say dev_database URL and prod_database URL. Now, if we do dev config, for example, then the env state variable, which is gotten from base config, actually, let me say that a bit differently. Now, when we create a dev config object, it will try to get the variables using the dev_ prefix. But the base config is something that happens before then, so we actually won't be able to see the env state with this. So what we have to do is instead load the .env file and look at the env state first, and then use that to either create a dev config class or a prod config. Well, I said class, but I meant object. A dev config object or a prod config object. How do we do that? Well, fortunately, it's pretty easy. For example, you can say env state is base config, create an object, .env state. And then if env state is prod, config is prod config. Otherwise, config is dev config. So this is a pretty crude way of doing it, but it's actually pretty close to what I would do in an actual application. I'll show you what I do in an actual application in a second. And at the end of the day, what you have is the correct configuration setting. Now, both of these variables do have access to env state. So when you go in here, config.env state still works, but you've used it to select what production or what configuration class to use. Okay, so that was a lot of information. What are your thoughts about ChatGPT? Do you think it could take our dev jobs? No, I don't think so. I mean, I've used it quite a lot, and it's good. Yeah, it's good. It's useful. It saves time, but it needs a human on the other end to make it work. Really, it makes so many mistakes that I don't think it's going to take our jobs. And then things like Auto GPT and stuff like that are just not useful at all for now. I'm sure they will be eventually, but no, I don't think so. I don't think they'll take our jobs. Okay, so how would I do this in actuality? It would be like this. Let me show you. Like this. So this is a function that takes in the env state, then defines a dictionary with either devconfig or prodconfig, and then based on that value, it gets, for example, configs dev, which is a devconfig object, puts it in there, and you end up with a devconfig object being returned. And if it was prod, then it would put that in there, and you'd end up with a prod config. And then you'd say config is getConfig, pass in baseconfig.env state. This is how I would do it. And you can have more configs than dev and prod. For example, a test config, that is something that I commonly have as well, a separate configuration class for tests, so that the development variables don't interfere with the test variables. My upcoming Fast API course is going to have more information on this, so I will give you guys a link to my upcoming course. You guys can check it out. I would appreciate it very much if you guys will have a look at it. That upcoming course is going to talk about Fast API, obviously, but it also has a lot of insight and information on project setup, logging specifically, testing. In that course, we do a lot of PyTest testing because the entire application has tests. So if you want to learn more about backend development, testing, and setup of Python projects and stuff like that, then that could be an interesting course. I would love it if you guys check it out. So yeah, I think that now you can see me. Yes, you can. So yeah, we're gonna call it a day here. It's well, I'm pretty ill, so my throat is starting to give. But I hope that you have learned something and enjoyed it. We're going to take this video and make a YouTube video out of it, or maybe two. We're gonna see how that kind of goes. But hopefully you've enjoyed it. You've learned something, and yeah, you've liked this whole setup, this whole idea of what we've got going on here. If you've got any questions, consider joining the Discord server and leaving your questions there, and also register for the waiting list on that Fast API course. That's coming out really soon. So thank you very much for joining. Thanks for watching, and thanks for chatting as well. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye.